welcome back for session 2 of Boundaries and Conflict. In raising an emotionally intelligent family, we have some really good things to share with you today. So let's dive in, shall we?
Yes, for sure. So I'm going to share 3 different quadrants of things that I want you to know. And I want you to know that I'm going to share different directions of boundaries in each one of my talks, and it's designed that way. So there will be some things that I say more than once, and the purpose of that is to help you put the framework around all of it so that when you have a situation where you have to set a boundary that you don't like, because most of the time when you're setting boundaries, it's uncomfortable, a lot of the times anyway. You'll have some different kinds of ways to think about it and pull from. So today I'm going to talk about 5 C's of boundaries. It's a framework. It just happens that they all start with C. So they're the 5 C's of boundaries. And the first one is clarity and communication. So what you don't want to do is be vague. You want to think this through before you set the boundary. A boundary isn't something that you do generally on the spot. I mean, maybe sometimes there are times if the kids are at a new place and you see things that you haven't seen before, you can say to them, hey, I don't want you to touch that over there at all. So that's a boundary that would be on the spot. But most of the time, especially if you're talking about setting boundaries with your parents or your in-laws or your friends or any neighbor, I mean any kind of a situation where a boundary is needed, you're going to want to have really talked it through with a close friend or your spouse or somebody and made a decision about it rather than just being, okay, we're just going to go with this. That's just not the way you want to do it. So clearly define what you're going after. Try really hard to be calm about it and non-defensive. I remember a roommate of mine in college. I wanted to borrow some shoes, and she says, "Oh, I just don't loan my shoes because I think that's unhygienic." And she was very calm about it. I was like, "Oh, okay." I mean, it was just a quick boundary, but it's something she had thought about, didn't want to do. We had, there were 4 of us living there, and she just didn't want that to start. So she put a boundary on it, and it didn't bother me at all. There was no conflict. It wasn't anything that I was like, how dare you? Like they're her shoes. She didn't have to loan them to me, so that's okay. So be really clear. Secondly, be consistent. So you want there not to be confusion, and you also don't want to teach people to disregard your boundaries because you set it, but then you don't do it. And I'll give you an example of that without being too revealing. There was a coach at a baseball game that I went to recently, and he kept telling this kid to stop crying, and if he didn't, he was going to be benched. I'm pretty sure the kid was his son. And one of the comments Ron made to me on the way home was, I've heard that coach say that to that kid so many times, but he never does it. If he would just do it once, the kid would learn to manage his emotions. No, this wasn't a tiny little kid. This was a middle 11, 12, 13, I don't know how old he was, but he wasn't tiny. And so you would set a different boundary probably on a little 6-year-old than you would on a 10, 11, 12, whatever. And he was trying to set a boundary, but he wasn't, there was no meat to it. There was no teeth to it. And so the kid wasn't learning to manage his emotions in the situation. And we kind of felt unfortunate for the kid because he doesn't know that that his coach, maybe his dad, is setting a boundary that isn't really a boundary. So
there was a boundary. So we don't do sleepovers, but there was a time when my parents, actually, the company that my mom was working for at the time, she won a trip, and it was a trip for 4, and so they invited Brian and I, and so we had to come up with families that could watch our kids because they're the ones that watch our kids when we're out of town or overnight. And so every kid kind of had a different sleepover at that point, but we don't do sleepovers, right? And so my husband's mom wanted to have a sleepover with the other cousins, and that was hard because we have this boundary that we don't do sleepovers. But then she called us out and was like, well, you did sleepovers at this time, right? And so, people are going to look for loopholes your
Boy,
boundaries.
that's exactly right.
And we said, well, that was an accentuating circumstance. As a general rule,
Yeah,
we don't do sleepovers.
yeah.
So
That's a good example. And I think that they have done sleepovers, but it was the fact that there were going to be other children that they didn't know all that well, that weren't necessarily had some of the same life
well, right, we don't know
philosophies.
we don't know our cousins all that well, and what we do know is that they're very different than us, and so
Yeah, right. So
Yeah,
that was just a place where they thought that's just really uncomfortable. The third C is courage / confidence. So it does take courage to set a boundary. It's much easier to just go with the flow and say, oh, well, no big deal. And sometimes you can do that, but there's sometimes you can't. When Trisha was little, because I was a therapist and I was working with women who'd been through trauma, and a lot of them had been molested or abused in some way, I was not comfortable with her having a sleepover until I knew that she could leave and walk home, or that she would have the sense to get herself out of the situation. Because when you're a child, adults are adults. You don't know what's going on. And so she was 10 before I let her sleep anywhere else. And that was in the neighborhood. It was probably older than that before I was really letting her just, sleep at some random friends from high school. And that, in high school, at that point, I have to believe that I've trained her to know what's safe and what's not safe. And so she had to make those decisions. And I got so much flack from parents for not letting my kids have sleepovers. And I would let them, you guys now call them late overs, and that's common now, but that was not common back then. I would say you can stay until everybody goes to bed, you can put your pajamas on, whatever, but you're coming home, you're sleeping in your bed. I just want to know where you are all night long. And I just had to really dig in on that and say, no, and people would say, well, you're just warped because you work with these women who have had trauma. Well, I don't think I'm warped because of it, but I do think I'm aware. And so that was a boundary I set for all three of my kids. And actually my kids set similar boundaries now. My two that have, old enough children where there could be a sleepover situation. So I appreciate that, because they're sleeping. There's really no reason for them to be elsewhere unless there's a situation where they need to be elsewhere.
I think that the what's interesting about this particular C and the courage is a couple of things. And one is that there's also courage in choosing your battles. And so being an over boundaried person is also going to be hard for the relationship. And so, there are lots of things that my parents do that we don't do inside of our home. So one of the things that I don't do is hand my kids my phone. My parents are more likely to do that, to let them play a Tetris game. And so I have to choose if that's something that I'm going to boundary, or if it's something that I'm just going to let slide when my kids are with my parents. Or another example is that we eat predominantly organic, and they
We don't.
And so when I'm there, I'm not going to boundary my mother on what she can feed my kids, because A, she loves them a lot. B, she cares for them, like literally time-wise, cares for them quite a bit. And C, it's okay. They're just, and so there's this mix of courage to trust and let go, and courage to set the boundary. And so an example of where I did set a boundary is that I really, really, really don't want them to have food dye. And so I set that boundary, which she cooperates with, and my dad doesn't as much, because he loves 7-Eleven slushies. He just loves them.
He is trying a little harder, but it took him a little while.
So there's that give and take, right? Okay, these are all the things that I might want to boundary my parents on, but here are the things that I think are most important to me, and how much damage is it really doing? And so there's a lot of questions in that regard too. And I think that's why it's important to go back to session 1, where you have to figure out, even where do you land more passive, or do you land more aggressive? And as somebody who lands more aggressive, it's really easy for me to set boundaries, and this and this and this and this, versus my sister-in-law ends more passive. And so she's, it takes her a little bit more to speak up. So there's a lot at play here. I did want to say, by the way, speaking of my sister-in-law and boosters, they changed the law in Colorado last year. So I said on our last session that there's not a law, and there wasn't until 2025. So one of the moms pointed that out to me,
Oh, wow.
that now it is law for you to be in a booster till
Well,
8.
then my 5-year-old grandson could have been arrested.
It was against the law, and we didn't know. So anyway, thank you for telling us that. What's C number 4?
Yeah. Well, and I also want to say, if your parents are wise, and if you can have this conversation with your parent, they might pick up on the fact, like I picked up on the fact when we were at Luke's basketball game, that Trisha doesn't really want the boys on my phone playing a game, which a game is relatively safe, I think. But she just didn't want them to, because she wants them
Present.
yeah, or go, bounce a basketball on the other side of the court, whatever. So then I sometimes remember to say, only if your mom says so, that you can. And she, I think, appreciates that I'm a little bit more aware of that. But we are a little bit clueless, because things were different for us when we were raising our kids. So you need to give us a lot of grace, because we really don't always pick up on the nuances, because it just wasn't that way. Or we might minimize the nuances because we just weren't worried about that. And I get why you're worried about that now, but we weren't 30 years ago. And you just have to know there's a big difference in raising kids now. I feel bad for you guys in a lot of ways, because I think it is much more complicated now than it was when my kids were little. The fourth one is compassion. You're setting a boundary for the purpose of self-care, but I want you to be empathetic rather than angry. If you have gotten angry, that probably means you didn't set the boundaries soon enough, and you need to back up and say, Mom or mom-in-law, and maybe you can't talk to your mom-in-law, so maybe your husband has to do that, and maybe your husband's not willing because he's kind of a go-with-the-flow kind of a guy, and then you have to really figure out what you're going to do in that situation, and we'll talk about some more of those situations along the way. But the goal is not to be mean and punitive. I really appreciate what Trisha just said. She doesn't want to punish me because I don't buy organic milk. They don't drink milk at my house all that often, and I think it's great that she's worked on not giving them milk with hormones. I think that's wonderful. I'm not going to do that for the little bit of milk that they're consuming at my house. So I do want you to remember that it's not, most of the time we have are really good intentions. Intentions aren't everything, because you can still make a lot of mistakes and have good intentions. But I do want you to think all the way around the whole circle of it, and not just, oh no, So.
And we see so many moms with really elevated nervous systems who just want to have control. And so this is something that I can have control over, and it really is damaging to a relationship, and it isn't an appropriate boundary.
So that leads to the number 5, which is consequences. There are consequences for you for setting a boundary. Some people, we used to call it change back. When I was in my husband's family of origin, I was very different from them. I was raised very differently than they were. They were from Iowa. I was from California. California is the land of fruits and nuts, literally and figuratively. So there were just a lot of free-spirited things that I could do or believe. Now, I was a pretty conservative Christian in my mind, but for them, I was kind of liberal, which is kind of a weird thing to experience when you think of yourself as one way and somebody else thinks of you as a different way, which tells you that there's really a continuum. So you have to understand that when you set a boundary, especially a boundary that somebody doesn't like, they're going to have this change back. For a while, they're going to really work on you, even if they're not conscious of it, to get you to not hold that boundary. They're going to test it really, far, whatever it is. So there's consequences that you can set for others, but there's also consequences for you. And that's one of the reasons you have to really decide, is this boundary necessary? When I set the boundary on her not spending the night places, I got a lot of flack from my neighbors and whomever it was. And I got criticism and I got judgment and all of it. I had to be prepared for that.
And there are consequences for me. I was left out at times.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I think it's really important that your boundary has a purpose, that it's serving, that you really are sure is needed or necessary or wise, because otherwise I just think you have to have that feeling, like she was saying, of there's just some things you don't have to make a fuss about.
But here's the thing, whoever you're putting a boundary on does have to follow the boundary. They don't have to like it. They don't have to support it. And so often it's like, I'm setting this boundary and I just want you to respect like I want you to like it. That's not part of setting boundaries.
Yeah.
So,
So part of the consequences is the fear that that affect you from setting good boundaries. That sense of, so I'm going to list like 6 of them. You might feel fearful to set a boundary because you might lose love or be alone.
mhm.
And in my neighborhood, I felt pretty alone sometimes when I set some of these boundaries that I felt was really important. And you have to deal with that. It doesn't mean you have to not set the boundary. It just means you have to deal with it. You have to understand that about yourself. You have to be willing to handle somebody else's harsh words. And I don't think that my neighbors and friends necessarily were intending to say harsh words. I don't know what they were intending actually. I just know sometimes what they said was very judgmental and kind of shaming. Like, you're a terrible mother because you did that. And that's hard. I had to deal with them and their own whatever issues that they might be having. You might also experience guilt. I remember setting a boundary on my dad, and I think I've told this story before, so I'll do it real quickly. He cussed like a sailor. He was a sailor in his young years, and he cussed like one, and I hated it. I would rather you slap me than cuss at me, truly. And I finally, in my 30s, said to my dad, I'm not going to keep calling you, because I'd call him like every month to 6 weeks. If you're going to cuss at me, I just hate it. And he hung up on me with an F you. And I felt guilt. And then I stopped feeling guilt and I felt sad. And I thought that was a much more appropriate emotion. And then I felt, that's important to me. I'm not going to back down on that. The next time I called him, he didn't cuss one time. It was never spoken of again. But he knew that I wasn't going to call him, and apparently he wanted me to. So there's an example of, and along with that, you might feel pain. So you might feel guilt and you might feel pain. In that situation, I felt both of those. You might fear losing approval, and that's very real, because especially if you have a really dominant, inflexible parent or friend, they think they know, especially if you're dealing with somebody who's really black and white, and it is this way and it's not this way. And they have no grace, they have no ability, and you all probably know people like that. I know Trisha does. You're going to lose their approval, and that's going to be painful, especially if it's somebody who you wished, gave you approval. And the last one is, there might be hurt feelings. Like I said earlier, you want to do it with grace so that you minimize hurt feelings, but there still might be hurt feelings. The example that she gave with her mother-in-law, I'm sure she was hurt that she couldn't have this sleepover with all of the cousins, because in her mind that everybody's the same. And in Trisha's mind, they're not. And even in Brian's. I mean, this is something they talked about, so it wasn't just Trisha, demanding something. So you can empathize with their hurt feelings, and you can even acknowledge them. I know this maybe hurts you.
Well, and you can have compassion on the fact that maybe they aren't good at setting boundaries. And so there's some jealousy there. When you're bold enough and courageous enough to set a boundary, I mean, I think people think in their head like, oh, well, I didn't set that boundary. Like, why does she get to? Well, because she's done the work, or she's done the healing. And so there's this envy. So there's so many layers, and you have to let them have their emotions about it and just stay in your lane.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What's number 6?
Well, those were all of them, because I kind of grouped guilt and feeling pain in the same one. So there were 6 of them. If you go back and listen again, you'll hear all 6 of them. So the last thing I want to talk about today is barriers to boundaries. The things that would, and the fear, there's some overlap in the barriers, but there's some other barriers that I want to discuss, and there are 6 of them as well. So the first one is denial. I used to get migraines about once a year, and they were full on, like the aura thing, and then this pain that you thought your head was going to explode. It's not a headache. It's totally different than that. And you'd throw up in it, and I would be in denial. When I would get that aura, whatever I was doing, I would be like, no, certainly this is not a migraine. I learned finally after 9 or 10 of them, no, this is a migraine. I need to go take I would just take Tylenol PM, but I would take enough of it so that I knew it was going to put me to sleep, so that I slept through the worst part of the pain. Denial means, okay, it'll be fine. Like the example of Trisha again, I think that's a great example. It probably would have been fine if they had all spent the night, but we don't. She didn't want probably. What if it wasn't? You know, what if something really bad happened in that moment? Um, you can't undo that, or you can't unsee it, or you can't unhear it. And so that was a boundary she chose, and she wasn't in denial about it. So it's really easy to say, oh, it'll probably be fine, it's probably okay. And sometimes that's okay to say. So I'm not setting a hard and fast rule here. I just, if you're a Christian, I want you to really trust that God will give you a sense about it. I really believe that. I feel like as I was raising my kids, God was very present in the decisions that were hard. And not that I made every decision perfectly. You know, there's always, you know, a second chance. But I really do feel like God did a lot of directing for me in my raising of my kids, and I'm very thankful for that. Along with denial can be ignoring. Just I don't want to see this. I don't want to worry about this. I don't want to think this is going to happen. And so I'm just going to ignore that this might be a bad situation. The third one is nagging. So if you have the kind of mother or mother-in-law or father-in-law, it's not always the mother. Don't want to put all the bad rap on her, although they tend to be a little bit more controlling of the environment generally. If you're just nagging her, come on, I told you, you know, especially if you do it with your mother, and you might even do it with your children. I mean, when you're setting boundaries with your kids, it's the same thing. If you've told them 5 times, it's like the coach I was talking about earlier. He's kind of nagging. If he's going to say that to his kid, then he needs to put his butt on the bench and have him not play the rest of that game so he understands what he's talking about. So say it firmly. It's okay to give a reminder. You can decide how many reminders, but in the end, you've got to follow through and don't just nag about it. Don't be surprised. You should only be surprised once. You're allowed to be surprised once. There are things that happen that you were like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. Absolutely there are. But then the next time you want to, okay, now that happened. Now what do I need to do about that? The fact that happened, and think through it and figure out if it's something that you have to set boundaries around or not. Blaming, deflection makes you powerless. If it's somebody else's fault, then you can't do anything about it because it's somebody else's behavior, it's somebody else's fault. So as much as possible, as much as is true, take responsibility, do what you can do. You can't control somebody else, but somebody else should also not be able to control you. So try really hard not to blame it on some other situation as much as you can. I know there's probably things that are other people's faults and you really are a victim to it. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about figuring out, okay, what can I do about this? And then along with that is either owning too little of the problem or owning too much of the problem. So some people take on responsibility that is not theirs. Other people will not take on the responsibility that is theirs. Having a talk with yourself in your head or someone you trust and having them help you figure out how much responsibility you have in this situation will provide real clarity for you as you walk along and try to figure out what boundaries you want to set. So that is what I have to present to you today. And next time I do a lecture, I'm going to be talking about 10 more principles of boundaries that come at this from different angles. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope it helps you start beginning the framework that you need.
Bye-bye.